The Poetry Nook is a cozy monthly conversation about the magic of poetry as a mirror and container for our lives. In each episode, we bring a poem to the table, or two or three, on a theme that speaks to us, and talk through all the language, logic, and emotions that come with them. I'm Charlie Hunt.
And I am Analía Vidal. Welcome to the Poetry Nook.
Happy June, Annie. Welcome back to the Poetry Nook with me.
We made it, almost, though, because, let's be frank, we are right at the end of May. This is going to come out in June. But yes. This is one of those years where, we're celebrating every single month that we make it through.
We've got a couple more days left in May, and, hopefully they go swimmingly. In the meantime, we've got a couple of great poems or perhaps songs today to discuss to get us through those last couple days and into the summer in earnest. Today we're going to be talking, our sort of theme of the month is music as poetry or poetry as music, depending on how we want to think or talk about it. We've got a couple very different offerings today that each of us have brought to the table, as we usually do. And I think they offer a couple of different perspectives on, whether, if you're looking at lyrics in a song, are they a poem? Is that a form of a poem? What does it mean to just have them by themselves, as opposed to married with the song that maybe they were intended to be with? A lot to talk about here. What comes to your mind sort of right off the top in terms of the marriage of music and poetry? I mean, they do seem to go, they don't have to, but they do seem to often go hand in hand, I feel like.
Yeah, I have to say, when we were discussing about maybe doing an episode like this one, it was interesting because, we were discussing the idea and it was exciting. And at the same time, for me, I kind of had this moment of do I even know what the distinction is? I don't think I do necessarily. And I did my research, but also I think there is an element of growing up, especially just writing poems, but also being very inclined to listening to music. I didn't necessarily think about the two in relation to one another. And it was interesting now to explore the ways in which there is so much cross-pollination in the type of writing and how to approach it and how to think about it. And also identifying people who have been very influential for me growing up, in the example of Patti Smith, who is both a poet and a songwriter and musician. And we're not going to cover her work today necessarily because I could do a whole episode on that. But
I was excited when you posted about her the other day. I was like, oh, we're going to get to talk about Patti Smith. So maybe another time. But your choice you ended up going with is amazing, and I'm really happy about it. But yeah.
Yes, I will say, just as an extra nugget, I will share at the end, before we wrap up, I will share the one song/poem that I suggest that I picked up from that research, just because, Patti Smith.
Excellent.
We cannot not say something about her.
Yeah, that's right.
But then her, there are so many others, right? There is Bob Dylan, there is Leonard Cohen. And so there is a lot of richness in this discussion. And it was very interesting to kind of start to unpack a little bit about that in that theme. But what about you? What came out to you when we were discussing this?
I was thinking about this question earlier today while I was out on my run, and I was like, how do I want to approach this? And of course, I took I took a little bit of the scientist mindset to it of what's the Venn diagram between poetry and music? It's well, a lot of times they both have words and they are structured oftentimes in stanzas, but at the same time, songs, music, can be really popular without having good lyrics, good poetry, or many lyrics, or any lyrics at all. Like instrumental songs can be really beautiful without having the traditional elements of poetry, which is like verse. And but at the same time, even a lot of those songs, right, instrumental music, when it's done in a certain way, it does have in common with poetry. I think the same thing that all art has in common with poetry, which is that it can make you feel something. It can remind you of things. It can dredge up memories. It can put you in a poetic kind of mind state, even if there are no lyrics, I think. Like both of what we chose today have words, and we'll recite them and talk about the words and what they mean. But, I think we should acknowledge that like I think music can be poetical even if it doesn't have lyrics, the same way a painting can evoke a lot of the same things as poetry. And so I think sort of no matter what we're talking about, we have this important element of the arts and what it can do to us and for us on a kind of emotional and philosophical level.
And I agree with you. I think that, ultimately the distinction that comes to my mind is that, at the end of the day, like it's all within the umbrella of art. And so the ultimate goal of art is to evoke a sense of like a feeling, a sense of connection between the art and the person who is both like producing it and also consuming it. And so there is that kind of like overarching theme that connects poetry and music and all the other modes of art. But then the distinction is the vehicle, right? So like in poetry, the focus is on the words. In music, the words are complementary to the music. And so like there is a little bit of that interaction where the lyrics by themselves may or may not be poetic, but the impact of how it reflects for us is tied inevitably to both the lyrics and the music. And so that to me, as I was like exploring this, that became like the ultimate, distinction. Is like can the words stand on their own? And also as a consumer, right? It's like, does this impact me the same way when I read it as a poem than when I listen to it as a song?
Yeah, I totally agree. And that sort of brings up, I think, another important distinction or element here that might be different with music than with poetry. And I'll sort of, if it's okay, I'll sort of use this by way of introducing the song that I chose because it contains this element, which is that authorship and who is doing the expressing is often different between music and poetry. With poetry, like I think pretty much everybody we've discussed and like all the books of poetry, if I pick up a volume by Billy Collins, like he's written all the poems. He is like the sole author of all the poems. Of course, you can have co-written poems, but authorship and performance for music, I think, is stranger and more complicated. Like you often have, like the artist I chose for this, the music group, which is called Watch House. They are composed of sort of two main people. They're a married couple and they make this music together. And they also have like other people who perform alongside them when they're performing live. So they are part of the experience as well. But when you go into, Spotify or Apple Music or whatever, or like if you have their LP and you look at the notes and the credits, like this song and both music and lyrics were written by only one of the two members. But it is who is named Andrew Marlin. But the singer on the track is his wife, Emily Franz, who is wonderful and is a great songwriter in her own right. But she didn't write this particular song, but she's the one performing it. And so we're getting it from her perspective. Whereas like with traditional poetry, of course I can go to a coffee house and recite and perform a poem written by somebody else. Like no one's stopping me from doing that. But most of the time, the person reciting the poem is the person who wrote the poem. And with music, I feel like that's an interesting twist that like is not always the case. Like plenty of musicians are singing, so very ably singing songs that they did not write, and like that's perfectly acceptable in the world of music, maybe sometimes looked down upon, but like that's an interesting twist here.
I'm just gonna be cheeky for a second and just say that the
Please.
only reason why you do not go to a coffee house and recite a poem is because we build a whole podcast for that.
Yes, that's what we're doing here, because we need people to
Exactly.
still listen to our podcast. So but yeah, like, but this is exactly what you and I do, like, each month is we read the poem, but like, neither of us would ever claim to be part of the creative process that went into that poem. Whereas, like, I'm going to I'm going to read this song, this poem in a minute, and I fully associate it with Emily Franz, who's the singer of who's the vocalist, and she plays guitar as well. But like, she did not write it, and that's not a shade to her, but it's just an interesting kind of aspect here, which is like, what is the writer's voice and where is it coming out, and that maybe that credit aspect is a little different here, and that often, like with music and lyrics, like sometimes you can't tell, like every just about most of the like Beatles songs that we know and love, they're all listed as like Lennon and McCartney, Lennon and McCartney, Lennon and McCartney, and probably like Beatles historians know exactly who like wrote which lyrics and who wrote which of them wrote which of the music that is married with it, and oh, this was more of a Paul song, this was more of a John song. But in a lot of ways you can't really ever know unless you were in the room with the Beatles while they were writing it, and so there's an interesting kind of mystery there that I think is fun. But all right, so I think I'll go ahead and read this one if
Let's do
that's
it.
all right. Okay. So this is a song called "Beautiful Flowers." It was written by Andrew Marlin of the band Watch House, which is he and his wife Emily Franz. They're one of my very favorite artists. They're amazing live. You should go see them if you get the chance. They are on tour this year. But I have a funny story about this song, which is one of my very favorites. It's that I'll share after I read it. But I will, like, Spotify did this thing in the past week where they like shared your top 100 streams of all time,
Yes.
of like the 15 years or however long you've been on Spotify, and this song was like number 7 or 8. I have listened to the song so many times I can't even tell you. Okay, so this is "Beautiful Flowers" by Andrew Marlin. Beautiful flowers in the morning dew, they're nothing without you. You flutter on by in a flash of color and you're gone, but we keep on rolling on. In 1885, when a man by the name of Benz put 3 wheels together in an engine 2, he had no idea it could be the death of you. But we keep on rolling on. I like to head out and arrive real soon. Kind of doze off in between. A little splash here, a tiny bump there. I clean off the window and I see real clear again. And I keep on rolling on. Beautiful flowers in the morning dew, they're nothing without you. You flutter on by in a flash of color and you're gone. But we keep on rolling on. Well, the summertime blues are burning red hot, red hotter than they've ever been. But if the whole world screamed at the top of their lungs, it wouldn't make a sound on the moon, much less the sun. But we keep on rolling on. Beautiful flowers in the morning dew, they're nothing without you. You flutter on by in a flash of color and you're gone. But we keep on rolling on. Big oil's got the money, and the money goes around. Lord, we don't know where it ends. And the more I see, the less I know which way we're all going to go from here. We keep on rolling on. I will say right off the bat, that was a very strange experience for me to read, like without. I'm not a good singer. You don't want to hear me sing this song, but it's so strange to me. I've listened to this, like I said, I listened to the song so many times. It's so strange to hear it spoken aloud by anyone, much less myself. Especially like repeating the choruses. I was like, should I repeat all the choruses? But I decided to just read it exactly as is. Any
So,
initial reactions to "Beautiful
yes,
Flowers"?
I actually wanted to reinforce what you just shared because it was similar for me. So when you shared the links, I listened to the song rather than reading to the lyrics. And so it feels a little bit like a very different experience. And so I didn't necessarily react to the reading now the same way that to the song. And I think like in the song, it's like there is a style in particular that makes me think like, yeah, of course it's going to be number 7 in your playlist. But the lyrics not necessarily land the same way. And as you're saying that, it also makes me think of there is a, when one learns a language, one of the go-to exercises that a lot of us have done in many languages, but specifically in English, is that we learn through songs. And so there is this very common exercise, which is you basically have the lyrics to a song with blanks. And so as a kid in school, you listen to the song and you try to fill in the blanks. And what's interesting about that exercise is that it helps you learn the vocabulary and identify and start like listening to it differently because there is a layer of the music, right? And so like then you don't
Mm-hmm.
forget.
Yes.
And I think it's also a very common experience as we are learning the language that sometimes we just make up the words, and a decade can goes by before you actually realize that the expression that you thought that song said was actually not the right one.
Yeah. Yeah. I think this is a common experience even for like native English speakers reading the English. Like this happens to me all the time. So, but yeah, it's so the tiniest percentage of the songs I have listened to in my life. Like I listen to a lot of music. Probably one out of like 200 of them do I go look up the lyrics and like actually read the lyrics as I would a poem. And it is a different experience to see them out there. I was sort of making on the fly decisions as I was just reading it of
Hmm.
like it was like working against muscle memory of
Yeah.
trying not to say them the way that she
The,
sung them, and I was like, oh god, what if I accidentally start singing it? But I was like, no, I'm gonna try to read it as if I had never heard the song before, and as if I was reading it like it was just a poem in a book. So I tried to do that, but it was even just doing that now gave me another like it forced me to sort of think more even more about the lyrics than I already have.
let me ask you the question that because I think that because you have such emotional proximity to the song originally and now you read the lyrics as a poem, I am curious to hear what those big distinctions you feel between the experience of listening to it and the experience of like reading it now and analyzing the lyrics to it.
You've set me up beautifully for the story I think you'll get a kick out of with regard to the song. So this song came out in 2021. I had already liked this band for a while, and this song, you listen to it. To your point, like it's my kind of song. It's acoustic. It's very like it sounds very nice. It's melodic. I find it very beautiful even without the lyrics. And it's called Beautiful Flowers, and it's like it's if you didn't know what the lyrics were, it could sort of come off as a very like tranquil, happy tune. And I had listened to this song many times and learned to really love this song, so much so that over the course of the first year after it came out, that we were coming up on my wedding day with my wife. And I was like, we were trying to decide on like the playlist and things like that. And like, what songs might we want to play like before the ceremony begins, but to like get people in like a sort of soft kind of acoustic-y mood. And I was like, Beautiful Flowers, like we love that song. It's a great song. And she was like, honey, like, have you really listened to the lyrics of that song? Like, it's about climate change and how we're all going to die. And I was like, huh. And I went back and listened to the song again and like read the lyrics. And I was like, it's not that I had never listened to the words, it's that I had never gone and read the lyrics like a poem.
Mhm.
And then I went to read the lyrics like a poem. And then I discovered like, it's about actually something like I think is really important and really care about. And, it's a sad story about how, you know, we drive a lot of cars and have poisoned our planet and like all of this stuff. And I was like, yeah, you're right. We probably shouldn't use that song for the wedding, but now I love it for this entirely different reason. So that's my funny story about how like, the gorgeousness of the melody and the music actually like masked the true meaning of the song for me in a way that I think really illustrates what music can both like add and complicate about a good piece of poetry like this.
So, a couple things about that. The first one is anyone who's listening or watching who is in the process of picking songs for important milestones, just use this as a cautionary tale to just check
That's
the
right.
lyrics, just in case.
Ideally. Yeah.
And the other thing that comes to my mind is I don't know if you've come across this, but there is a meme as a reel that has been coming up a lot on social media, especially in the past few months. And I think especially after, the beginning of the year when we had like the Benito Bowl in the Super Bowl and like Bud Bunny
Hmm.
blowing up and all of this stuff.
Yeah.
There has been this reel that is like very, very telling of our Latino culture and the way in which you might be dancing to a salsa song or just like, moving around, just like feeling all the joy in the world. And then you pay attention to the lyrics, and it's basically a whole bunch of like trauma dumping from everything that we have been going through. And so there is like, I think it's an interesting but very real reality of our culture and our art that a lot of the art is actually rooted in a lot of like very traumatic, violent, hard experiences that we have had. And the way that we alchemize it is by creating joy from it. But if you don't pay attention, you might find yourself like listening and singing to lyrics that are not as joyful as you thought they'd be.
Yes, that's exactly right. I mean, yeah, this is I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but there are a number of ones like this where like, oh, it's like and it's a I think it's a really like strong and interesting artistic choice to juxtapose like like a thumping, like a really happy beat or something with lyrics that are it's like you're sort of like trying to sneak in really
Hmm.
deep feelings within a underneath the bed of music that sounds really happy, and you're sort of making an artistic choice about that juxtaposition. In this case it was more just like I was dumb and didn't read the lyrics, but like I think in this case, like it's like if you and this was basically my initial experience of the song, which was like listening to the music, and I had the chorus in my head. This chorus that is repeated three
Hmm.
times. Beautiful flowers in the morning dew. They're nothing without you. You flutter on by in a flash of color and you're gone, but we keep on rolling on. Like that is. It's not that I didn't know that it was a sad song. Like that's a sad chorus, but the chorus strikes you as potentially just being about like, the flowers aren't as beautiful without you. You floated on by in a flash of color and you're gone, and it's like it sounds like
Impermanence.
grief for a yeah, it sounds like grief for a person, and like I miss you, and you had to go away, and like and we try to find a way to roll on or move on. But then when you listen to the rest, like read the rest of the song, it's like, no, it's like grief about planet Earth and like the world that we have like laid waste to. And and it's a sad story about like how we got here and with these other characters that I can talk about. But yeah.
It also makes me realize the different ways in which we experience and relate to art and especially music. In part because I think for me, it's almost like second nature. Whenever I listen to a song that I like, I immediately go to the lyrics. And I think part of the reason why is because, like I mentioned, not just for English, but for every language that I have learned, I remember, like, I learned through songs. Like, I would have this exercise. I remember learning German, and there is a song called Amadeus that to this day I can still sing in my head. and it was like one of the first songs that I learned German with. There is a song that my sisters and I, if refreshed enough, we can all sing together when we learn Chinese together. And so it's a tea song that we all learn as part of the language learning. And so that made it so that for me, it's almost automatic that whenever I come across this song that I like, I'm going to check the lyrics. And I did that back in the day when we had dial-up internet. And so like my internet activity as a teenager was to look for songs and lyrics. And now I've always been very grateful for the functionality of like reading the lyrics as you go on Spotify, because that's a thing that I go to more so than anything else.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like the modern version of, like you mentioned, your dial-up internet. Like what I was thinking was when we used to have CDs and you had the little jacket
Hmm.
and it would have all the lyrics inside. And so you would like buy a new album and you would put it in your little portable CD player, and like, at least that's what I would do, and like pull out the little jacket and like read the lyrics as you go with the music. And I don't know how many people really use like the lyrics function on Spotify. I would say I use it most often when I like didn't understand what someone said or like wanted to go back and like check what it was. But yeah, that's a super useful element of it, and that I think has changed over time, especially as you have like playlists and mixes and things like that, where like not everything is on the same album, and so it's not all in the same place. So yeah, that's an interesting aspect of it. The use of grief, I think, is really important here. Like I was saying before, like in the chorus, they end it with like, "But we keep rolling on." And it's you could imagine that as a way of being like, well, you were here and now you're gone, and I just have to push forward despite my grief. But to me, like at the end of every stanza is this line, "But we keep on rolling on." And I once I learned what the song was really about, um, it actually strikes me as more angry than out of grief. That it's like we learn more and more about what you know driving around cars and factories and things like that, what like pollution is doing to our planet, but we keep on rolling on. Like we just keep doing it anyway. We haven't really stopped. Yeah, it's not like once we learned about how driving cars can pollute our planet, we just stopped driving. Like we did the opposite. That, and that's reflected, I think, in the third stanza, when that goes like, "I like to head out and arrive real soon, kind of doze off in between, a little splash here, a tiny bump there, I clean off the window and I see real clear again." Like to me, that's describing like riding in a plane for 4 hours and making your way across the country. Like you like to go fast, and like that's why we have these vehicles, and we didn't really think about the consequences. And even now that we know the consequences, we don't. So there is grief here, but in understanding that broader context of like what the song is really about, it's also kind of sardonic and angry a little bit. Especially when you
Well,
get to the end and they're talking about like big oil's getting all the money and all that stuff. Yeah,
like calling out the apathy.
it
Hmm.
definitely is. And I think it's the other part, honestly, the part that really gets me about this, which I think still puts it in the category of like sad poem instead of mad
Hmm.
poem, is the second stanza, which like taught me a little something about history. That in 1885, when a man by the name of Benz put three wheels together in an engine two, he had no idea it would be the end of you, be the death of you. Um, and they're talking about Carl Benz, who in 1885 invented the Benz patent motor wagon, which is like basically like he's often called like the father of automobiles, and it was basically the first wheeled vehicle that ran on like that time's version of an internal combustion engine. And it just like that, those lines made me feel terrible for this guy who like you know had no idea. Like he didn't. I mean, who knows if he would have done things any differently, of like, well, I invented the car and now our earth is falling apart. But it's very, I find it like really poignant, like invoking this character that probably a lot of people haven't heard of, but like Yeah, that's one thing I
Which
like about the story.
Which it's interesting because as you were describing, in this interpretation, it got me thinking about how, what would this song be right now with the reality that we're
Mm,
living in? And
yeah.
I think that to a certain extent, like this can be said about every single technological development that we don't really know the consequences and the directions that it will take because a little bit like we've also discussed this for poems, right? When one writes something, when one creates something, we have our internal motivation for doing so. Perhaps there is an external motivation too, but we have something that pushes us to do it. But we have to always remind ourselves that there is no way of controlling or knowing how it's going to be received. And so
Hmm.
once you put things out there for others to relate to, connect to, react to, you lose complete control over like what that will look like. And in some ways, like it stops being yours because everyone will make it their own in different ways. This actually reminds me one of the very briefly that during the research when I was coming across, the like work by Patti Smith, I came across her, an interview of her where one of the most iconic lines is Jesus died for somebody else's sins, but not mine, which is the opening line of Gloria. And she shared in an interview how people would send her letters saying that they are praying for her or kind of like thinking, like she was kind of like devilish for saying something like that. And it turns out that Patti Smith is actually like very in tune with her own like faith, and she's like, I love
Hmm.
Jesus. They just
Yeah.
don't understand that the reason why I'm saying that is because I just don't want Jesus to take responsibility for what's mine. So it was like it's a very interesting example of that, right? Of the we don't know how things are gonna go.
Yeah, we don't know the impacts. And I had never thought about it as like the parallels with, the troubles sometimes of being an artist if you don't know how or in this case like an inventor of non like
Hmm.
he probably built this machine and thought, wow, this is cool. It like goes without anybody pushing it and like there's no horses attached to it. And um I, but the one of the differences that I think is really interesting, like you mentioned, what's the modern application? It's like all these technological things, but like the one I was thinking of was like these, and we don't have to get too deep into this, but like these like AI data centers that like use a
Hmm.
ton of water and like a ton of power, and that people are not so happy about. Like AI is something we're all like learning about now and is a very recent phenomenon, but like we are immediately confronted with the environmental impacts, what it will cost us to go all in on this in our economy or whatever else. And like there are debates to be had. We don't have to get into it. But like with this guy, like it was 100 years before like anyone in the mainstream was talking about the impacts of climate change, and well over 100 years before it became like a key issue in at least like our politics. And so like I have a lot more sympathy for this guy than I do for like, I won't name names, but like some of the folks who have like written a lot of this AI code and are like using up all our resources. But it's an interesting parallel too, like the stanza with the airplane. It's like I like to head out and arrive like I don't like to spend a lot of time traveling. I like to go fast in the airplane and make it across the country really quickly. And in this one, it's like I like to get information really quickly, and I don't like to have to do all the research. And so I'm going to use all these resources in order to take this shortcut. And I know that's like a pejorative way of putting it, but I do think there are parallels there. So thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think that, we have traditionally attached us a positive interpretation to the idea of progress. And that is actually not
Yeah,
a given.
right. It's much more complicated. Well, why don't we turn things over to you, Annie? You have like I think a differently structured kind of poem that you are bringing to the table, at least in terms of how it came about and what its relationship with music is. Do you want to tell us all
Yes,
about it?
let's do this. So, um, the poem that I brought today is actually started as a poem and then it was turned into music. And so a little bit like kind of like the other direction from what we
Mm-hmm.
covered with Beautiful Flowers. Here, this is a poem um, by by Cesar Vallejo um, that it's also originally written in Spanish, then translated by Don Patterson, and so there are multiple layers to this work. The first one that I would say is we are going to share in the show notes the song version of Cesar Vallejo's poem, which was sung by an iconic Argentine artist, Mercedes Sosa, in a beautiful rendition that basically goes word for word on this poem. And we're going to share that. But the reason why I picked this poem and its song version is because I think it also touches in a lot of the conversations that we have had, not just in terms of the translation of poem to song or song to poem, but also the language translation of it. And so every now and then we have these conversations about, like the different interpretations in the different languages. And in this case, I found the translated poem thanks to the Poetry Foundation. If you haven't checked it, go ahead and check it, poetryfoundation.org. Great organization to keep an eye on. And they also include a note from the translator. So I also found it very interesting to kind of like have that third perspective, since we often touch on the translations so much. So I'll start by reading the original poem in Spanish. I will say every time that I read this poem, a little something in me breaks, so I might get emotional. But yeah, I'll read it first in Spanish and then in English, and then we'll discuss.
Sounds good.
A mi hermano Miguel, by César Vallejo. Hermano, hoy estoy en el pollo de la casa, donde nos haces una falta sin fondo. Me acuerdo que jugábamos esta hora y que mamá nos acariciaba, pero hijos. Ahora yo me escondo, como antes, todas estas oraciones vespertinas y espero que tú no des conmigo, por la sala, el zaguán, los corredores. Después te ocultas tú y yo no doy contigo. Me acuerdo que nos hacíamos llorar, hermano, en aquel juego. Miguel, tú te escondiste una noche de agosto, al alborear, pero en vez de ocultarte riendo, estabas triste. Y tu corazón, y tu gemelo corazón de esas tardes extintas se ha aburrido de no encontrarte. Y ya cae la sombra en el alma. Oye, hermano, no tardes en salir. Bueno, puede inquietarse mamá. Miguel, by César Vallejo, translated by Don Patterson. I'm sitting here on the old patio, beside your absence. It is a black well. We'd be playing now. I can hear Mama yell, boys, come down. We'd laugh, and off I'd go to hide where you'd never look, under the stairs, in the hall, the attic. Then you'd do the same. Miguel, we were too good at that game. Everything would always end in tears. No one was laughing on that August night when you went to hide away again, so late, it was almost dawn. But now your brother's through with this hunting and never finding you. The shadows crowd him. Miguel, will you hurry and show yourself? Mama will only worry. It is a poem that gets me mostly because the grief of losing a sibling is so palpable.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in both languages, I think like Don Patterson here does a fantastic job, and I'll read the note in a minute, where he also talks about the difficulties of translating this. But this is one of those songs in Latin American culture that is not misleading. When you hear Mercedes Sosa performing it, you feel the weight of all of this grief and all of this pain. And I'm curious to hear your reactions and perspective on this.
Yeah, I listened to the song first. Like, it says a lot about the rendition that I listened to that first, understood very few, if any, of the words, but felt the same feeling in her rendition as I then felt afterwards when I went to go and read the translation. That, like, my first thought, first of all, it's a beautiful, beautiful rendition, such a beautiful song. And so thank you for sharing it with me. But then when I went to read the poem in English, I thought, I was just so struck by how appropriate and sensical of a rendition it was in the song format. That this was, and I don't know the history behind her choice to record it and to do it in that way, but it strikes me as something that like this wouldn't work for all poems. Like, there are some poems where like it probably wouldn't make a ton of sense to try to like record a song version of it. To me, the song was additive. It brought a lot to it and created something new and beautiful and heartbreaking, even beyond just the words on the page.
This is a meeting of the souls, in a sense, because in many ways, so the Mercedes Sosa style is very much in line with the type of rendition that she played for this poem. And so it really does, if I didn't know that this was originally a poem by César Vallejo, I would not be able to tell that she wasn't the one behind this song. And so
Yeah,
I think that
absolutely.
this is one of those situations where, I think that translates really well, because also the styles are very complementary or kind of like in sync with one another. I was not familiar with it at all. Honestly, like, this was one of those examples of when, we pick a theme and then I just like go on searches and start like kind of like going down a little bit of like rabbit holes. And I came across this one. And it really struck me. And I actually, to be honest, this has been a few weeks now, but I am, I'm going to continue the shout out to Poetry Foundation here, because one of the things that they have that I absolutely love is that they have a daily email where like they send you the poem of the day. And so I receive my poem of the day every day from the Poetry Foundation. And I'm almost certain that I actually found out about this poem through that system, because one of the things that I do, I don't have the data set like you have it, but what I do is I flag emails on my inbox. And so I know that any flagged emails from the Poetry Foundation are poems that I actually really like that I will go back to.
Yeah, they're an incredible resource. Like 90% of the time when we're sharing like the links to the poems we're sharing, they can be found on the Poetry Foundation, which either that means like we have great taste or they have great taste, or maybe we both have great taste. So
I wanted to share also a little bit of this translator note, and I might not, I won't read all of it, but just like like the first two paragraphs, and I encourage people to read the rest on your own with the links in the show notes. But because I found it very interesting, kind of like what he shares about his own experience coming across this poem, and then also, daring to translate it. So I'll go ahead. This is part of the translator's note that Don Patterson wrote originally in 2008 about the translation to A Mi Hermano Miguel. It reads, I've known Vallejo's A Mi Hermano Miguel for a while, or at least what ghost of it survives my wretched Spanish. It's a pretty well-known poem and has often been translated into English. A song version was even recorded by the Argentinian singer Mercedes Sosa. It came to mind again about a year ago while I was at something of an impasse. I couldn't bring myself to start work on a poem of my own, an elegy for the poet Michael Donaghy. Donaghy was born to Irish parents and raised in the Bronx. By the time of his death in 2004, he was one of the most highly regarded poets in the UK. Few US readers know his name. I began fiddling with this poem for no good reason I could think of, oblivious even to the big fat clue of the title. Vallejo's original poem is no sonnet, but seems to me to have the soul of one. I've developed the habit of choosing different formal rules for the version than those followed by the original. It works as a sort of guarantee of process, so that line-for-line substitution isn't even a compositional option. The results are never very faithful to the poet, but can be true, in their weird and indefensible way, to the poem. I confess that I find most faithful translated versions mere homage. They really belong to a category of meta poem. The free version probably belongs to a category of literally theft, if we're honest. Still, there were uncomfortable decisions to make. There is no patio in the original poem, but a stone bench or pollo. I couldn't sit on it. Y tu gemelo corazón de estas tardes extintas is the loveliest single phrase in the original poem, but I found I couldn't use it, not least because it died in English every way I turned it. So I'll stop reading there, but I found at least this first part interesting for all the reasons that we have discussed so far in our conversations and even today, right? There is this element of the grief that comes through in this poem, a different type of grief from the one that we were discussing with the lyrics of the song, but at the same time, a grief that was familiar enough for Patterson to be inspired by when he was like thinking about the elegy for this fellow poet. There is also this element of acknowledging that, there is a very distinct approach to the process of translating this poem that is not like line by line. There are additional difficulties to it. And yet, like we discussed, there was this sense in which, like you mentioned, the translation of the feeling that traveled across the English, the Spanish, and the song versions of the poem.
Right, that he, in taking on this task of translating it, and that he kept, he says he kept fiddling with it and returning to it without even sort of realizing it. And he kind of makes fun of himself too. It's like in English translation, it's like the song is like to my brother Michael. It's like your friend Michael who just died, and it's he's sort of so blinded by his own grief that he couldn't even really recognize it. But that there is some kind of magic in there that clearly came through. It's like emotional kind of mystery and magic that came through, that by taking the act of translating the poem, he channeled his own grief, channeled the grief of the original poet, and created something that is the same but also different. And he, like you say, he changes certain parts of the poem. He's not trying, it's much, especially in this case, much more of an art than a science, as we've talked about before with translation. And I find that beautiful. I mean, I think that he was able to sort of, do this literal translation of a poem, but then sort of figuratively translate his own grief into actual words that he sort of half borrowed from someone else to create something new. And so it was like a translation on multiple levels. And then after that, the translation that Mercedes Sosa did with her rendition, right? This was a whole different kind of translation that made it something else completely new.
And to your point, I think like this actually like brings us to a close beautifully, because it's a little bit of like a full circle, right? That ultimately what we were discussing about the role of art to evoke certain experiences and feelings for everyone involved in that process. It translates across mediums, whether that is in poem, in lyric, and song. And in this case, it's an example of how ultimately the grief is like the connective thread throughout, and yet it's both like palpable and relatable across.
Yeah, absolutely. The feeling, the emotion, the conceptual aspects of it are kind of the living tissue that is connecting all of it, whether it's different renditions or takes or interpretations on the same original work, or whether it's, if you're a musician and you're trying to sort of marry music and lyrics together and create something interesting. And I think our two approaches here today sort of reflect that, is like because you hear sometimes about musicians who, some of them like write lyrics, like they write poetry and then put music to them. Others do the opposite. Like they will, like I think like Kurt Cobain was famous for this. Like he would write full songs, like the music, and like base it all around a guitar riff, like mumble nonsense words for the lyrics with the melody, and then fill in with words afterwards. Whereas, like, I think Leonard Cohen was this way. Like, he would just write poems and poems and poems, and then write music that he felt went along with it. And then others, like I saw the New York Times did this thing about, like, best living American songwriters. And I was watching the interview with Taylor Swift, of all people. And she was sort of describing this kind of meld, this mix of things where, like, she'll have some words, she'll have maybe kind of a melody that goes along with it, but they will both inform each other and morph and change along the way through the process. And that's what I think is that's one of the things I think is in common here, and I think is really true for the Patterson translation, which was like the process of doing it was the art and was the creative output that really accomplishes something personally and creatively. I've loved this conversation because, like, exploring how music can play a role here, I think has really illuminated that aspect of poetry for me.
I agree with it. And to add to your list of the description, I just happened to come across Bud Bunny's Tiny Desk last year in 2025. And he shares that one of the songs from his latest album, I think it's like Lo que le pasó a Hawaii, is a song that he actually dreamt of. And he couldn't go back to sleep until he just like put it on paper. And so, the reason why I found it interesting is because, like, it's tied with everything that we were talking about. And it's also tied with our previous discussion about, like poetry and imagery and dreams, where like we were exploring a little bit of that, and how this also becomes a little bit more of kind of like coming together, even in this like very esoteric way.
Yes, the art. This is why, like, I can never be as creative as these other people. Like, I don't know. You dream it, and it just comes into being. It's all like the whole process thing. It's very mysterious, especially with some artists. But I think that's what makes it beautiful too. Is that we don't have like blueprints for how to create a song or how to write a poem. And that would kind of like take all the fun out of it anyway. Like, it's not a model that you run. It's as much as I love running models, so anyway, we love poetry for that and many other reasons. And we're glad that you love poetry too, dear listener. So, Annie, thanks for joining me, and thanks to our listeners for joining us as well for another month in the Nook.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, everyone listening. Make sure to subscribe and comment and share your thoughts on this so that we make it a conversation among the two of us, but also everybody else who's listening.
Yeah, share your own favorite songs as poetry, lyrics that you love. We'd love to hear them as well. Always looking for good new music and poetry recommendations. And with that, we'll leave you off for this month. We'll see you again in July. Thanks, everyone.
See you next month.